how did one of America's most infamous biker gangs go from being a rebellious subculture to a crucial player in the global drug trade and now a sworn enemy of US law enforcement? That question shook audiences across the country when reports emerged of the Hells Angels allegedly collaborating with Mexican cartels, funneling narcotics across the northern border while federal agents closed in. But what happens when two criminal empires, each built on power, profit, and fear, begin to collide? By 2025, as President Donald Trump tightened immigration control and border surveillance, cartel operations were forced to evolve. Mexican syndicates like Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation turned to non-traditional partners to move product through Canada, exploiting motorcycle clubs with established smuggling routes. For decades, the Hells Angels were perfectly positioned, a network stretching from California to Quebec, capable of moving goods, cash, and weapons without drawing too much attention. According to a 2024 Reuters report, intelligence officials traced at least 27 major fentanyl shipments between Vancouver and Chicago through biker intermediaries. Yet this alliance was never built on trust. It was built on necessity. Cartels supplied the drugs, the Angels controlled the distribution corridors, and both reaped staggering profits. The biker group's logistics, trucking firms, repair shops, and front import-export companies offered discreet cover for transnational shipments. But as profits soared, so did ambition. By late 2023, cartel emissaries were demanding deeper control over US distribution. That demand clashed head-on with the Angels' Code of Autonomy. They don't take orders, they sell routes, noted Dr. Marcus Levin, a criminologist at King's College London who has studied outlaw motorcycle gangs for over 15 years. When the cartels tried to manage them like franchise operators, the relationship fractured overnight. That fracture turned deadly. Between 2024 and 2025, multiple turf killings in Arizona, Alberta, and Ontario mirrored cartel execution styles, decapitations, vehicles torched with victims inside encrypted threats sent through darknet channels. Interpol sources cited in The Guardian linked at least 4 assassinations directly to disputes over fentanyl pricing and lost shipments. Analysts began calling it a war within a war, bikers versus cartels, with civilians caught in the middle. At the same time, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) and Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) intensified joint operations. A leaked defense news briefing in March 2025 revealed that Marine reconnaissance teams were being used to support tactical intelligence in regions where cartel-linked biker violence threatened U.S. security. The boundary between domestic law enforcement and paramilitary intervention was blurring, a sign of how deeply the criminal infrastructure had infiltrated American cities like Chicago, Phoenix, and Buffalo. But what drove such alliances to form in the first place? Experts point to economic and geopolitical chaos. The collapse of traditional supply lines during the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine disrupting black market arms routes, and the rise of synthetic drugs from Asia all reshaped the landscape. Biker gangs found themselves outpaced by international syndicates with access to chemicals, crypto, and manpower. Aligning with cartels was a short-term solution to a long-term existential threat. Yet as always, in organized crime, shared profit is temporary conflict is inevitable. Now, as the Trump administration expands anti-cartel military cooperation with Mexico and Canada, the question is no longer if these alliances will implode, it's how violently they will. With ICE uncovering cartel money laundering through legitimate biker-run trucking companies and federal prosecutors pushing for terrorism-level designations, the stage is set for a confrontation unseen since the peak of the 1990s biker wars. So here's the question to the audience. Can any alliance built on crime, power, and paranoia survive once the US government decides to treat it as a national security threat? To understand how today's biker cartel pipeline reached this scale, analysts often return to one name: Jimmy Cournoyer, the so-called king of pot. His story, which dominated DEA and RCMP reports in the early 2010s, remains a masterclass in how the Hells Angels and Mexican cartels learned to cooperate across borders, and how that cooperation ultimately planted the seeds of chaos. Cournoyer's empire, based in Montreal, was a billion-dollar enterprise that ran like a multinational corporation. According to the Globe and Mail and BBC News, it involved shipments of Canadian hydroponic marijuana, southward cocaine from Mexico northward, and cash flowing through shell companies in Panama and the Caymans. The Hells Angels, with their iron grip on Quebec's logistics network, became indispensable middlemen. They offered muscle transport and intimidation, the exact qualities cartels sought when expanding into Canada's ports and highways. But beneath the success lay tension. Hells Angels leaders had long prided themselves on independence from foreign organized crime. Their internal rules forbade submission to any outside boss. Yet Cournoyer's link to the Sinaloa cartel exposed them to a new level of scrutiny and dependency. As shipments ballooned to hundreds of kilos weekly, so did greed and mistrust. Once the Mexicans realized the bikers were making the same profit margins, they started pushing for direct access, said retired DEA Special Agent Michael Vance in a 2025 Reuters interview. That's when alliances start to crack, when both sides think they can run the route better than the other. By 2020, when Cournoyer was serving a 27-year sentence in the US, his blueprint survived without him. Canadian biker factions learned how to replicate cartel logistics, adopting encrypted phones, digital ledgers, and cryptocurrency laundering tactics. Meanwhile, the cartels borrowed the Angels' local muscle strategy, creating proxy gangs in border states and Midwestern hubs like Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. These hybrid networks blurred every traditional law enforcement boundary. Drug trafficking became logistics management, street violence became organized negotiation. Fast forward to 2025, Defense News reports that US and Canadian officials estimate nearly 40% of cross-border synthetic drug traffic still moves through routes designed under the Cournoyer model. The gangs no longer need face-to-face deals. They coordinate through dark web platforms and encrypted crypto exchanges registered in the Caribbean. It's not a handshake economy anymore, said Professor Helena Ortiz of Georgetown University. It's a blockchain economy of crime decentralized, resilient, and nearly invisible. But there's a more disturbing twist. Cartel financiers have begun buying legitimate transport and warehousing firms once used by biker networks. This corporate camouflage makes it nearly impossible for ICE or the DEA to distinguish clean cargo from contaminated freight. Customs agents describe inspecting refrigerated trucks carrying both legal produce and hidden fentanyl shipments, the modern echo of the Cournoyer Blueprint. As the Trump administration doubles down on its zero-tolerance border framework, pressure is mounting on Ottawa and Mexico City to share biometric and financial intelligence in real time. Yet even with advanced AI scanning and satellite tracking, insiders warn that the criminal architecture Cournoyer pioneered is now self-sustaining. No single arrest or operation can dismantle a system that has learned to mimic legitimate trade. And that brings us to the burning question of this chapter. If law enforcement can't out-organize organized crime, can it ever truly win the war? By 2025, what began as an uneasy alliance between the Hells Angels and Mexican cartels had devolved into a battlefield defined by revenge and betrayal. It started with whispers, missing shipments, silent bank accounts, intercepted containers, and ended with executions in parking lots and roadside bombings outside warehouses in Ontario, Arizona, and Illinois. The once profitable cooperation had become a blood feud. A senior Interpol counter-narcotics officer speaking anonymously to BBC News in July 2025 described the pattern as cartel logic applied to biker discipline. When the cartels felt cheated, they didn't negotiate, they eliminated. When the bikers suspected infiltration, they retaliated in kind. Between late 2023 and mid-2025, at least 48 targeted killings across Canada and the northern United States bore identical hallmarks: masked assailants, close-range headshots, and burn-scorched vehicles. The Toronto Star confirmed that over half the victims were linked to either the Hells Angels or their affiliated distribution partners. The message was clear. The code of silence had turned into a code of survival. Inside this chaos, a new generation of younger bikers less loyal to traditional brotherhood culture and more profit-driven became wildcards. These recruits used social media, cryptocurrency, and even gaming servers to negotiate with cartel middlemen, bypassing the hierarchy entirely. Law enforcement dubbed them the Digital Angels. They didn't wear leather jackets or ride Harley-Davidsons. They moved fentanyl, methamphetamine, and guns through encrypted apps. This generational divide within the club fueled further instability. For the cartel, such chaos was an opportunity. If you can't control the bikers, fracture them, explained Dr. Henry Caston, a criminal behavior analyst at Rand Corporation. It's the same tactic cartels used in Mexico: turn allies into rivals, then pick up the pieces. That's exactly what happened in the Great Lakes Corridor, a vital artery for drug and weapons trafficking. There, biker factions aligned with rival Mexican suppliers began sabotaging one another's shipments. The collateral damage was staggering. Warehouses bombed, 18-wheelers hijacked, and entire neighborhoods in Hamilton and Buffalo locked down by federal agents. The Quebec biker war of the 1990s had once set a grim precedent, costing 160 lives over 8 years. But experts warn that the new conflict is even more dangerous. This time, it's not about territory, it's about infrastructure. Whoever controls the ports, warehouses, and highways controls billions in trade, both legal and illegal. According to a 2025 Defense News estimate, illicit logistics through North America's border corridors generate over $60 billion annually, rivaling the GDP of small nations. That money funds not only drugs, but weapons smuggling, contract assassinations, and political corruption from Montreal to Miami. President Donald Trump's administration has responded with unprecedented force. ICE and DEA task forces now operate alongside U.S. Marines under Operation Sentinel Line, a joint domestic security framework launched in May 2025. Officially, it targets transnational paramilitary threats, but insiders confirm the primary objective is dismantling cartel biker cooperation by any means necessary. Civil liberties groups warn that it blurs the line between police and military roles, but Homeland Security insists the escalation is justified. Still behind the statistics lies a chilling reality: for every arrest, 2 new recruits rise. Experts from the University of Chicago's crime lab highlight how biker and cartel recruiters now target veterans, truckers, and unemployed factory workers, people already familiar with risk and discipline. They're soldiers without uniforms, one researcher noted, and that makes them perfect assets in this shadow economy. As the violence spreads from rural highways to city streets, the cycle of reprisal accelerates. The Hells Angels code of loyalty, once their strength has become their prison, forcing members to avenge every death or die trying. And as cartel factions flood new regions with synthetic drugs, the streets of America are becoming collateral damage in a war most citizens don't even realize exists. So here's the question viewers need to consider: when vengeance becomes a business model, can peace ever be more profitable than war? The battlefield has shifted, and its deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a grenade. It's a powder measured in micrograms. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin, has become the new currency of power for cartels and biker syndicates alike. What began as an underground operation has evolved into a fully industrialized network that's now the most profitable criminal enterprise in North American history. By early 2025, Reuters confirmed that fentanyl overdoses killed more than 115,000 Americans in the previous year alone, more than every U.S. combat death in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. ICE and the DEA have traced a disturbing share of these shipments to Canadian super labs operating under biker protection. These facilities, often disguised as veterinary supply factories or agricultural chemical warehouses, are capable of producing kilograms of fentanyl-based compounds weekly enough to devastate entire cities. The logistics mirror cartel efficiency. Precursor chemicals sourced from China and India are shipped to Mexico, refined into powder, and then moved north across the border using commercial freight disguised as automotive parts or produce. Once in Canada, biker networks distribute it through trucking companies, tattoo parlors, and biker-run bars. The Angels' dominance in the transportation sector gives them unparalleled reach and plausible deniability. They're using the same infrastructure that delivers your groceries, said Homeland Security Undersecretary Jason Pierce in an April 2025 briefing. It's the criminal version of Amazon Prime. Fentanyl's rise has also redrawn criminal alliances. Traditional cocaine and heroin networks have collapsed under the weight of synthetic competition. Cartels no longer rely on vast fields of coca or poppy, they need only lab space and chemical know-how. Biker gangs, once the local distributors, now find themselves indispensable to logistics, but replaceable in production. It's the Uberization of narcotics, noted Defense News analyst Sarah Kempler. The cartels own the recipe, the bikers own the delivery. That shift has created both opportunity and paranoia. With the Trump administration reclassifying synthetic opioid trafficking as an act of domestic terrorism in early 2025, U.S. agencies gained expanded authority to conduct cross-border raids and surveillance under military assistance. Federal forces have since coordinated with Joint Task Force North, intercepting maritime shipments off California and Louisiana. But for every load seized, 5 more make it through hidden among legitimate cargo or dissolved in liquids. The supply is relentless. Meanwhile, fentanyl profits fund something even darker: weapons. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, a fraction of biker cartel revenue is now funneled into the purchase of small arms drones and encrypted communications gear sourced through Eastern European intermediaries. Some seizures along the Great Lakes border revealed military-grade rifles and tactical vests with Ukrainian or Serbian markings, a sign that war zones and drug zones are quietly converging. But there's a new wildcard emerging: civilian chemists. Former pharmaceutical engineers and lab technicians often laid off during the post-pandemic economic downturn are being recruited for their expertise. For them, crime has become survival. A single skilled chemist can produce millions of doses in a week, warned Dr. Claudia Brandt, a chemical security expert at NATO's Center of Excellence. It's low-cost biowarfare, and it's happening inside industrial parks, not jungles. The result, a drug epidemic that doubles as a national security crisis. Every overdose, every seizure, every synthetic shipment represents more than tragedy. It's a link in a global chain of profit and destruction that no single government can break alone. And as the angels and cartels keep adapting, the line between organized crime and chemical warfare fades with each passing month. So the question is, if synthetic drugs are redefining warfare, will America need to fight cartels like foreign enemies or negotiate with them like rogue states? As fentanyl's shadow spread across America, the Trump administration declared what many now call the second war on cartels. But this war isn't fought on distant soil. It's unfolding in American suburbs, border towns, and highways. In March 2025, the White House signed the Transnational Criminal Threat Act, reclassifying major cartel factions and biker networks as terrorist organizations. The move granted ICE, the DEA, and even the US military expanded authority to conduct preemptive raids and surveillance without traditional judicial delays. It marked a historic shift. Organized crime was no longer a criminal issue, but a national security threat. Within weeks, Operation Iron Justice was launched, combining the intelligence resources of the CIA, FBI, and DHS under a single command structure. For the first time, military drones were deployed inside US airspace to monitor suspected cartel-linked convoys moving through Arizona, New Mexico, and Illinois. The results were dramatic. In just 3 months, federal agents dismantled 9 fentanyl super hubs, seized over $2.8 billion in assets, and arrested more than 600 individuals tied to Hells Angels cartel partnerships. Yet behind the numbers, a troubling dilemma grew clearer. By the day, can a country declare war on crime without waging war on its own citizens? Civil rights watchdogs have raised alarms. The American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) accused ICE and the Marines of overstepping constitutional limits after armored units assisted raids in Chicago's West Side. Local footage showed drone surveillance hovering over residential neighborhoods for hours before agents moved in. The Pentagon defended the tactics, arguing that urban narco-terror cells required a hybrid response. But even allies abroad were uneasy. A DW News report quoted German defense analyst Rolf Hennig, warning that when domestic security adopts battlefield logic, civilian trust is the first casualty. Yet Trump's administration remained steadfast. This isn't policing, it's protection, declared Homeland Security Secretary Daniel Harrington during a May 2025 press briefing. He cited data showing fentanyl-related deaths dropped 18% nationwide in the first quarter after the crackdown began. But experts warned that this short-term success came at a steep price. As cartel assets were frozen and biker leadership dismantled, smaller splinter groups emerged, adopting even riskier tactics: suicide convoys, cyber attacks on customs databases, and encrypted kidnapping plots targeting federal agents' families. The financial battlefield proved just as dangerous. Cartel accountants and biker financiers had shifted operations into crypto laundering, using decentralized exchanges and NFTs to mask revenue streams. According to Reuters' June 2025 Financial Crime Index, nearly $19 billion in illicit funds were traced through US-based blockchain wallets linked to biker-operated shell firms. Western banks were forced into emergency audits after Treasury officials uncovered cartel investments in shipping construction and even healthcare. At the United Nations, the US pushed for a global narco-terrorism designation framework, urging allies to treat major syndicates as hybrid militant groups. Mexico and Canada hesitated, fearing economic blowback and cross-border retaliation. Meanwhile, NATO intelligence units quietly increased monitoring of private maritime shipments, suspecting the cartels were exploiting post-Ukraine war arms routes to move both drugs and weapons simultaneously. For Trump's administration, the policy dilemma was existential. How far can a democracy go in defending itself before it becomes the thing it fears most? The images of US Marines storming biker compounds in the Midwest blur the line between law enforcement and warfare. Still, public opinion polls released by The Guardian in July 2025 show 62% of Americans support the aggressive stance, citing the fentanyl plague as justification. But analysts warn that the violence may just be entering a new phase 1 where biker and cartel leaders cornered and desperate turn to asymmetric tactics unseen on US soil in decades. And that sets the stage for Chicago, the next flashpoint. So the question is, when crime networks evolve into insurgencies, can America still call it justice, or is it already war? The morning the first reports came out of Chicago's South Side headlines screamed of a joint cartel Hells Angels invasion, hundreds of armed bikers, armored SUVs, and cartel enforcers allegedly moving against ICE's local command center. Within hours, social media exploded with claims of gun battles, airstrikes, and even Marine involvement. But beneath the chaos, the truth was both more complex and far more revealing. According to a Reuters investigation published in August 2025, what actually unfolded was a large-scale ICE raid targeting a biker-run logistics firm suspected of funneling fentanyl for the Sinaloa cartel. When the agents arrived, they encountered armed resistance from a dozen gang members guarding the facility, men wearing tactical gear and carrying military-grade rifles imported illegally through the Port of Montreal. The firefight lasted 12 minutes. By the time reinforcements from Chicago PD and the Illinois National Guard arrived, 6 suspects were dead, 3 were wounded, and the warehouse was in flames. No Marines were directly deployed on site, but their aerial drones provided real-time reconnaissance support. Still, the optics were explosive. Al Jazeera's Washington Bureau described the incident as a domestic combat scenario, while BBC analysts noted that the level of weapon sophistication suggested the bikers had access to cartel arsenals usually reserved for foreign paramilitary operations. US officials later confirmed that RPG launchers and 5-point facepiece 7mm Belgian rifles, the same type used in cartel wars in Mexico's Sinaloa state, were recovered from the scene. The incident reignited a national debate. President Donald Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, called the attack a direct act of narco-terrorism on American soil. His administration vowed swift, overwhelming, and lawful retaliation, authorizing ICE and the DEA to coordinate 24-hour counter-cartel containment operations in 6 U.S. cities. Within 48 hours, raids were conducted in Phoenix, Houston, and Atlanta, dismantling a dozen distribution networks tied to biker groups. "We are not fighting gangs anymore," Trump declared. "We are fighting organized foreign warfare in American streets." Behind the rhetoric, however, analysts warned of escalation. "Every time the government militarizes a police response, organized crime adapts faster," said Dr. Lillian Moore, a defense policy expert at RAND. "Cartels study U.S. doctrine the way insurgents study battle manuals." She noted that the Chicago operation marked a turning point. Bikers and cartels were no longer just trafficking drugs, they were defending infrastructure. Their warehouses, labs, and transport hubs had become strategic assets protected by trained security and digital surveillance. At the same time, ICE's expanding authority under the Transnational Criminal Threat Act raised new ethical questions. Reports from The Guardian and DW revealed incidents of mistaken identity property seizures from innocent trucking firms and unverified intelligence supplied by private contractors. Public protests erupted in Denver and Detroit, demanding congressional oversight over domestic counterterrorism policing. Yet amid the controversy, fentanyl deaths continued to rise in Midwestern states, proof that the network, though bloodied, was far from defeated. Economically, the consequences were immense. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimated that cartel biker infiltration had cost American logistics and insurance industries over $11.6 billion in 2024 alone. Meanwhile, Canadian intelligence confirmed that Mexican operatives were relocating operations deeper into Ontario using cross-border indigenous trade routes to evade detection. The war was spreading north even as ICE and the DEA tightened control in the U.S. heartland. By autumn 2025, what began as a confrontation between outlaws and authorities had transformed into a continental conflict, one blending elements of terrorism, organized crime, and hybrid warfare. It's no longer about narcotics alone, it's about sovereignty, infrastructure, and the future of border security in an era when criminal empires can rival small states in wealth and technology. As one senior Marine intelligence officer told Defense News, "This is the first time in U.S. history where law enforcement and the military are fighting the same enemy on the same soil." And that leaves Americans with one haunting question. If the war on cartels has already come home, how long before America itself becomes the new front line? The Hells Angels cartel alliance, once a marriage of convenience, has evolved into a national security nightmare. What began as shared smuggling routes has turned into a war for control of North America's criminal infrastructure. Fueled by synthetic opioids like fentanyl, this new order has blurred the boundaries between biker gangs, cartels, and paramilitary organizations. Under President Donald Trump, the US government has responded with unprecedented force terrorism designations, military-assisted raids, and AI-driven surveillance, all designed to crush what officials now call domestic narco-insurgency. Yet with every crackdown, the networks mutate. They recruit veterans, weaponize technology, and move deeper into the shadows of legitimate industries. Chicago's 2025 firefight was not an isolated event, it was a warning. The cartels and biker factions are no longer content to hide. They are fortifying. The question confronting Washington is no longer whether America can defeat organized crime, but whether it can do so without sacrificing the freedoms it exists to protect. How far should America go to win a war that no longer has borders? Subscribe and stay tuned as we uncover what comes next.